Before today's lesson will be from James chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. Once again, James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. I'll be reading from the ESV today. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and self-ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and as a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It is so good to see you this morning. John was talking about, as we were observing the Lord's Supper, things that Jesus would have been thankful for. As we are thankful for him as well, and I'm so thankful for all of you. I'm thankful that Brent's taking the day off today, and I'm getting to have this special treat to get to speak to you this morning. Thank you so much. Again, every single one of you, especially speaking for all the trainees, David included as well, that the support that you as a congregation offer to us is invaluable. It's priceless. It can't be measured. And so we're so thankful for not only Brent, but all the work that all of you have done as the trainees come through this congregation. So thank you so much. If you have your Bibles open there in James chapter 3, this will be kind of the overarching theme of our lesson this morning. You know, life is full of high points and low points. By high points, I mean full of comfort and encouragement, excitement and achievement, things that we look forward to, and when they come to pass, we're like, wow, this is great. Sometimes we even say, I'm still riding that high. I'm still living that high point in life, and I'm so excited and encouraged by it. On the same coin, the other side, life sometimes has and often does have its low points as well. It's very relative. If we have high points in our life, we're naturally going to have low points too. And by low points, I mean times of discouragement, depression, and when things don't seem to be going our way. Life is full of high points and low points. As Brent had mentioned even in the class this morning, sometimes in those low points, those times do strange things to people, or rather, people do strange things in the low points in their life, don't they? Sometimes, like we were talking about even in class this morning, when some difficult trial comes upon us or some temptation is laid in our way and we succumb to our desires and to that temptation, we sometimes, compared to all our friends and relatives and the people who know us best, change. Sometimes we do things that people would say, David would never do that, when we're presented with those difficult, those low points in our lives. Have you ever had one of these low points? I'm going to answer that question for you. I know you do, because we all have high points, and if we have those, I know we have low points too, every single one of us. In those low points, have you ever made what seemed to be an irreparable mistake? Have you then borne the consequences of those things, and maybe even still today continue to bear the consequences of those poor choices that we made in those dark places in our lives? This morning, we're going to be talking about Moses, and about a particularly low point in his life as well. And we're going to be talking as well about this time of folly. If you'll look over, once we get this started, if you'll look over to the book of Numbers, chapter 11 and verses 10 through 15. Now, as you're turning there, put a marker in James. We will be here over and over again during the sermon this morning. But look to Numbers chapter 11 and verses 10 through 15 as we get ready to learn about Moses' folly, about this low point in his life and the poor choices that he made that led him to bear consequences that were fully deserving of him because of the things that he had done. However, Moses doesn't just dwell in his folly. He doesn't just sit and pout in the consequences deserving of him, but he continues to live in a relationship with God and to do better from there on out. So while he has a low point in his life, while he succumbs to temptation and even to sin, he doesn't let that hold him down and continues to grow in a relationship with God. So this morning, while we'll talk about his folly, we'll also talk about his wisdom and what he decided to do in his continuing relationship with God and how to overcome those things, even though his life was still filled with consequences for his choices. Let's go ahead and take a look at the problem first. You're already there in Numbers chapter 11. This is going to preface what we'll get to as we move on through the book of Numbers. But let's go ahead and talk about Moses' folly and the choices that he had made. In Numbers chapter 11, we're starting to see that the poor choice that he makes in the future, which we'll get to in a moment, was a long time in coming. It wasn't something that just happened one day, and when the temptation came, he didn't just succumb just because, oh no, he made a mistake, but this was something that's been growing with him, something that he's been leading up to. In Numbers chapter 11, the people are complaining again, as it is with this kind of comedy of errors of the relationship with Israel and with God. And it says in verse 10, "Then Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused. Moses also was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, 'Why have you afflicted your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you have laid the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I beget them, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a guardian carries a nursing child, to the land which you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep all over me, saying, give us this meat that we may eat. I am not able to bear all these people alone, because the burden is too heavy for me. If you treat me like this, please kill me here and now, if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness.'" See Moses' talk with God. First of all, we see the people complaining. Okay, we've seen this over and over again. We kind of come to understand that this is how they are, it seems. They've seen God provide for them over and over again, and they're still not content, and so once more, they complain to him. Now, Moses has been an arbitrator and a mediator between them, and we expect a little bit more out of Moses. But as he comes to God, it says that he was also displeased there, but he's not displeased with Israel. He's displeased with God placing this burden on him. So he comes to God, and he whines, and he begs, and he pleads. And eventually, not because Moses had a necessarily persuasive argument, but God does decide to give the people of Israel the meat that they've asked for. But it comes with some consequences too. As you keep reading past this text, we won't read it right now, but I invite you to read it as you go home. Make notes of this as well. You see that God promises, he says, you want meat, I'll give you meat. And he gives them meat of quail for 2 days' journey in either direction, 2.5 cubits deep of quail. And he says, you want meat, I'll give it to you, and you'll be so sick of it. After you're done eating it, it will be coming out of your nostrils. There will be so much meat. Just a side trail or a rabbit trail, if you'll bear with me for a moment. I wanted to take a look and see, could I find out how much quail this really was? And I was starting to think, okay, you got 2 days journey, maybe make about 20 miles in a day when you've got women and children and wagons and livestock and all those different things. Okay, maybe 40-mile radius then. We've got a 2 cubits deep thing. So I did the volume of a circle and I came up with 70 billion cubic feet approximately of quail. God's not kidding around. You want quail? I will give you quail. And so Moses, remember what he says there at the end of that passage that we just read in verse 15. He says, if you treat me like this, if you're going to treat me like this, please just kill me now. It seems like Moses is in a pretty low point in life, but it gets worse. Let's go over to Numbers chapter 20 and verses 10 through 11, where we see that, as we had just read here in Numbers 11, Moses thought very highly of himself. He thinks he doesn't deserve this. He thinks that he's better than what God has given him here. And so he's starting to have problems already, which are going to manifest themselves in this passage in Numbers 20. He's thinking that he deserves more than what God has given him. And God's given him so much. But he thinks he needs more. So, in Numbers chapter 20 and verses 10 through 11, we see here that he fails. And this low point presents itself in his life. This temptation comes in front of him, and his own desires lead him to sin, and he fails because he wanted to appeal to the people rather than God. Numbers chapter 20 and verses 10 through 11 says, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels! Must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. All right. We look at this and we say, wow, there's obviously a miracle being done there. There's God doing this thing here as water is coming from a place where water shouldn't come from. But if you read just before this, you'll see that God gave Moses very clear directions as to how he was going to conduct himself with the people. He said that you'll go and you'll stand before them and you will speak to the rock, and then water will come from it, and God would be praised and glorified. So Moses gets up and he says, must we, Aaron and Moses, bring water for you out of this rock? And then he hits the rock with his staff and water comes out. God was going to provide for his people anyway, water for his people anyway. But Moses succumbed to a temptation in his life. This is his folly. As you read through this context, before and after as well, you'll see that all the time leading up to this, it's no longer becoming that the people of Israel did what the Lord said. It's not the Lord has said, but now it's becoming me, I, especially from Moses. Must we bring water out of this rock? I don't deserve this. Do something better for me if I found favor in your sight. Moses wanted to seem important to the people. And that's why he took matters into his own hands in that way. So he's been thinking highly of himself. He failed then because he didn't appeal to God and do what God had asked, but it appealed to people, tried to make himself stand up before them or stand out before them. And this is his error. If you keep looking through the next couple of verses there to verses 12 through 13, look at what the conversation is like between Moses and God just after this. It said, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. This was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them." Notice again what's going on, because Moses wanted it his way. Me, I. One of the main purposes of God bringing the children of Israel out of Egypt to hallow himself, to glorify himself, was being undermined by Moses. Moses, being God's servant, was undermining God's purpose, and God had to act in his justice. And as he does so, he says, gives the punishment there as we just read, Moses will not be allowed to go to the promised land. How much lower can you get? After this suffering here, after this folly that he has perpetrated and now must endure the consequences for, what else is there worth living for in life? I mean, as a Hebrew, you think of a Hebrew. They've spent 400 years in slavery in Egypt. They've got nothing but what God has given them as they've come out of the land. And he has promised them for over 600 years that they would have a place to go in Canaan. They would have a place all their own to call home. God has given them so much. And now he's taken it away from Moses because of Moses' error. We might, for a second, emotionally think, why are you being so harsh on Moses? It's just one mistake. But remember, God's name, not only here but everywhere, will always be glorified, will always be hallowed. And how dare we step in the way of that? But while we know and when we start thinking, well, things are about numbers, things are about prestige, and I want to seem important before people, let's remember Paul's encouragement and exhortation in Romans 15:4, that whatever things were written before were written for our learning. The things that Moses had done here, while tragic and terrible, are for our learning. But notice here that this might be the end for maybe one of our stories. If we found ourselves, I know if I found myself in this place before this lesson, before I had read this and studied these things together, I may have made some more terrible decisions. I might have given up. But Moses turns it around, and now he uses wisdom. Let's go ahead and then to the rest of the lesson here, as Moses had forgotten to honor God, that he continues on in 3 points that we'll continue through the rest of the lesson. I think James chapter 3 brings out. So if you still have your marker there, look back to that passage, James chapter 3, and starting in verses 13 through 17. We'll get to that here in just a moment. What we'll see here is that as Moses had endured this folly, as he had perpetrated this folly, and now is enduring the consequences of this, he will not be allowed to go into Canaan, that he now turns his life around. And so from here on out, he doesn't question God, he doesn't quit God, and he doesn't have any qualms about continuing in God's service. You know how hard it is to alliterate with the letter Q? but I think we did an all right job. So let's see what Moses had done as he had not asked any questions from here on out. Let's go over as we keep reading from this passage as well. You've got James 3 there with your hand as you're looking back and forth between here and Numbers. You'll see that Moses failed. There's no question about that. We're not going to make excuses for him. He failed. But even though he failed, he did not ask questions. You think of the low points that come in our lives, or maybe when our sin or our errors are called out and it's made accountable to others, and we start to ask questions. We start to question people's judgment, like, how dare you look at me and judge me that way, and how dare you look at my life and say that I'm in the wrong, and then we start to look at them and say, well, look at all these things that you've done, and we start to question people. And we see that in life, we see that in the people that we know, and we don't always expect that of others. We say, but it was their fault. It wasn't me, it was their fault. We saw that in Genesis, didn't we, with Adam and Eve? This woman you gave me, it was her fault, but it was Adam's fault. Can't, maybe, we might ask of God, if we were in Moses' position, can't you do something just a little bit more fairly for me? Couldn't you, look at all the work that I've done for you. I helped as I brought the people out of Israel. You brought me over here, but now I've been doing all this work. I've been bearing this burden. Couldn't you be a little bit more fair? Do I really deserve this? But Moses doesn't question God. From here on out, actually, Moses becomes very silent through the rest of Numbers, and only speaking up once or twice, but not anything of large consequence, not trying to persuade God of anything, not trying to question God of anything. We don't see him whining or debating anymore. We don't see any of that. If you look over in Numbers 14, in verses 11 through 23, we know, as we'd already read, that Moses is familiar with speaking with God in terms that, I don't know, if I was there, I would be hesitant to speak to God in some of the ways that he does. But what he's doing there is he's bringing out God's attributes, and he's talking to God, about the things that God has always done. In Numbers chapter 11, let's get here, cold fingers. Sorry, did I say Numbers 11? I meant Numbers 14, verse 11. And we could read through this if we had a little bit more time, but let's skip down to verse 17. Because at this point in time, God has just brought the consequences that Moses has experienced in Numbers 20 that we already read. He's brought this down on the entire nation of Israel several chapters prior, here in chapter 14. All of that generation that had refused to go into Canaan would not be allowed to see the promised land. And they were called to wander in the desert for 40 years until all that generation had passed on, had died, and their children would get to go into the land. So this consequence that God is enacting on Moses in Numbers 20 is not anything new. He's already done this for the people back in chapter 14. But look at 17. As Moses is debating, is trying to persuade, is trying to talk with God, verse 17 he says, "And now I pray, let the power of my Lord be great, just as you have spoken, saying," so now he's calling God's words into account in their discussion, "The Lord is long-suffering and abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But he by no means clears the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the father on the children to the third and fourth generation. He says, pardon the iniquity of this people, I pray, according to the greatness of your mercy, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt even until now." God has said they will not be allowed to go into the promised land. Moses says, act in mercy, act in loving kindness as you've promised, pardon them. Now look at what God says next. In verse 20 it says, "Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word." His word, as he's talking to Moses, is really God's word. Moses is just using God's own words with him. He says, I have pardoned them. He's forgiven them of this sin. However, there are still consequences in life. From here on out, while God has pardoned them, the consequence, that is, that they would not get to see Canaan, still exists. He's forgiven them, but there are still things that they must endure. As you keep reading in verse 21, he says, "But surely as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice, they certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him, and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it." Notice again what God says here. He says, I have pardoned them. I've forgiven them. But there are still consequences to bear. And that happens in all of our lives for the poor choices that we make. we have consequences that still carry on. But as Moses talks with God and debates with him, you notice that he doesn't do that after his conversation of his own sin. He doesn't go back to God and say, pardon me. He doesn't say, look what you said, because Moses knows full well what God is like. Moses said those words to God in Numbers chapter 14. Now, I want to show you a couple of pictures here as we get up ahead. Can you imagine how both God and Moses would have felt in this scenario? For all of us, especially when we were kids and when we got in trouble with our parents, that pit that's right there above your stomach and in your chest, and that feeling that you know you've done wrong, and you know it's coming down on you when Dad gets home, and you know all of these different things are going to happen. You know there's going to be consequences. But have we thought about Dad? And for those of you who are parents, the feeling that you have when you know that you have to punish your children. You know you would set up the standard. You'd set up, this is what is right and this is what is wrong, and they've betrayed that. They've sinned against you as you've set up those rules. You know that no parent enjoys that feeling. No parent looks forward to punishing their children. No good parent, and God is a good parent. However, he must. If you could bear with me for a moment as we fast forward a little bit, this picture here, obviously not taken by Moses or anyone in that time, is of the summit of Mount Nebo. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, this is where Moses is led up by God to go and die. And from this view, you get to see the land of Canaan. You get to see the promised land. You get to see what God had promised to his people who loved him. And can you imagine after Numbers 20, after being told you'll get to see it, but you won't get to go into it, can you imagine how bleak a view this would be? It's pretty. It's got hills. There's some trees there. But you don't get to go experience that. Can you imagine how God feels as well? That Moses has walked with him for such a time. Moses has been doing what he's asked for him, but Moses failed. Moses sinned. God doesn't want to remove him from this, but God must act in justice. There are consequences for the choices that we make that lead us into sin. But as Moses goes back to Numbers chapter 20, as we go back there as well, Moses doesn't question God. He doesn't question his judgment. Instead, he uses heavenly godly wisdom. Look at James chapter 3 and verses 13. We'll read that passage there. Verse 13 of James 3, James asks us, who is wise and understanding among you? If I'm going to raise my hand and say, I am, then this better be me. He says, let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. Moses knows that God is wise, and he will act in submission and meekness before God. And he does so from this time out. From here on out, you don't see Moses saying, me, I anymore. You only see him saying, as the Lord wills, or as the Lord has said. Tim has been taking you through these classes. I remember when we were still here a few years back, we were in Numbers, and you know all the places where it says that the Israelites did as God has said, and you've seen that before. And from here on out, that's all Moses ever does, is what God said. He doesn't question God. He doesn't ask questions of his circumstance. What else do people do in the low points in their lives? When difficulties come and when the consequences seem at least to be too difficult to bear, sometimes we go against our character and sometimes we quit. But Moses didn't quit. If you look over to places like Romans chapter 12 and verse 3, you'll see a characteristic that often comes with something that Moses had exhibited before, thinking too highly of himself. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 3, Paul says, for I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. This is something that we as Christians are expected to do, not think of ourselves more highly than we ought, like Moses had done, but it's a lesson that Moses learns in the consequence. He learns that it's not time to quit, it's not time to give up, but it's time to continue and to persevere and to keep going, thinking of himself just how he ought to think. Again, as we talked about, as far as a Hebrew is concerned, there's nothing else to live for. So what's Moses going to do? Is he going to go back to Egypt? The person known as the troubler of Egypt, is he going to go back there and find comfort and safety and peace in life? No way. Is he going to get to go into the promised land? No, God has refused him of that. So what's he going to do? Is he just going to sit and pout in the desert and just say, you guys go on without me. I don't have to go that way. I don't need to walk all that way with you complainers. No, he continues with them. He keeps walking with them. He keeps leading them through the wilderness by God's decree. What we see in people that are suffering from consequences and think they're too much to bear and start to think, man, maybe I could give up. Maybe I could quit and get away from this. We start to see some things from people like, maybe I can bring these other people down with me. Moses, refused from the land of promise, might have been able to bring the people of Israel down with him. If I can't have it, no one can. And we see people do that sometimes. But Moses doesn't quit his responsibility. Moses doesn't quit his role with the people of Israel. Have you ever felt in your consequences maybe sorry for yourself and get kind of in that funk where nothing's going to make it better because I deserve more than this? That's thinking too highly of ourselves. Do you ever feel like this shouldn't be happening to me? Like Moses had said, again, Romans 12:3, that's thinking too highly of ourselves. If you feel like you're not getting what you deserve, this might be a sign of something even worse than just thinking too highly of ourselves, if we could say that. This is a sign of bitter envy and jealousy. Look back to James chapter 3 and verses 14 through 16. Here James is contrasting and comparing wisdom that comes from below, which he says is demonic, it's sensual. The Greek word there is psychikos. It pertains to the senses, what makes me feel good, what I want. That's demonic wisdom versus heavenly wisdom, wisdom that comes from God. There's a difference between the two. That demonic wisdom, he says in verse 14, looks like this. It's manifest in this. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, that looks like I want what they have. That looks like if I can't have it, they shouldn't be able to either. That's bitter envy. That's jealousy. He says if we have that in our hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. Can you imagine all the possibilities that Moses could have done from here on out? Maybe he could have made another golden calf. Maybe he could have led the people of Israel in confusion and chaos because if they could get it and he wasn't going to get it, he was going to take it from them. He could have done so many different things, but he doesn't. He faithfully lives out his role with God as a leader of the people of Israel, giving these charges by God himself. How many people do we know, or maybe even ourselves, have quit after the consequences of sin have set in? Don't be like others. Be like Moses, who even in his consequence learned heavenly wisdom. People often, like we'd studied even in this morning's class, where we study the Word of God and when there's others there to help us as well, so that we could be corrected and reproved, people often quit because that's too difficult. But that's heavenly wisdom to endure and to learn the lesson. Finally, as we bring our lesson toward a close, we see that Moses did not ask questions of God. He didn't question God's judgment. He didn't quit the people of Israel. He didn't quit as God's spokesperson for them. And finally, he did not have any qualms. In fact, let's move on here a little bit. He did not have any qualms about his role. First of all, if you'll go to Numbers chapter 27 and verses 16 through 23, you'll see that he had no qualms, no reservations about preparing Joshua to take his place. As you're turning there to Numbers chapter 27, can you imagine this for a moment? You're working at your job, and you've made some mistake. It might have been premeditated, it might have been an accident, whatever. We're not really concerned for that for the analogy. But we've made some mistake, and the boss says, you're fired. This was in your job, this is in your job description, in your contract, you're fired. That's justice, and there's nothing I can do about that. But can you imagine if he said, before you go, as you're going to get your last paycheck, can you go and train your replacement for me? Can you go and get somebody that you think would work out really well and take the time and work with them and get them to be, better than you were? And maybe then that will work out. Can you imagine that sort of relationship with your boss? Can you imagine what you would do if that was presented to you? Now, God is acting in righteousness. He's acting in justice. He's even acting in mercy. He could have done so many other things with Moses. But he says to Moses for him to go and find his replacement. God's done that with so many people. He's done that with Elijah to Elisha. When Elijah had suffered the consequences of his bad choices, and when he was thinking about quitting and giving up, God said, go train your replacement. He does the same thing with Moses as well. In Numbers chapter 27, again, as we read this, look at Moses' demeanor through his words. See that he has now accepted what God has done as being right and being good, and is just doing his job as God would ask of him. In verse 27, it says, "Let the Lord, the God of all spirits and all flesh, set a man over the congregation, who may go out before them and go in before them, who may lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep which have no shepherd." So Moses presents this to God. I imagine God already had this in mind. And so in verse 18, God responds to Moses, and it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua, the son of Nun, with you, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, and inaugurate him in their sight. And you shall give some of your authority to him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient. He shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim, that at his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, he and all the children of Israel with him, all the congregation." Now notice verse 22. "So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, and he laid his hands on him and inaugurated him, just as the Lord commanded by the hand of Moses." Moses didn't quit. Moses didn't question. He did all that God had asked and had no reservations. You might think, here's a little bit of a rabbit trail again. You know, Moses had two sons, Gershom and Eleazar. We don't really know where they're at right now. They may have died in the wilderness. They may still be around at this point in time. Only a few passages talk about them. You can read about them in 1 Chronicles 23 and verse 15, where you see Moses' lineage there. But you can imagine if they were still around, God, I've got some sons here. And I think they would do a pretty good job. And you know, Joshua's a great guy. Joshua has been helping him out for a long time. But maybe Gershom would be suited for this role. And he might have exhibited some partiality there. Maybe some reservations about God's choice. But he doesn't. He doesn't bring them up. He doesn't bring Gershom or Eleazar up, but is content as God has made the choice in Joshua. If you look over to Deuteronomy 31 and verses 1 through 8, not only does he have reservations about training his replacement, but he brings him up and encourages him and instructs him and wants him to succeed. That is not what earthly demonic wisdom looks like. Earthly and demonic wisdom wants him to fail. Maybe God would regret that he replaced me and that he didn't let me go into this place. That's earthly wisdom, but Moses uses heavenly wisdom. Look at Deuteronomy 31 and verses 1 through 8. It says, "Then Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel, and he said to them, I am 120 years old today. I can no longer go out and come in. Also the Lord has said to me, you shall not cross over this Jordan. The Lord your God himself crosses over before you. He will destroy these nations from before you, and you shall dispossess them. Joshua himself crosses over before you, just as the Lord has said. And the Lord will do to them as he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites in their land, when he destroyed them. The Lord will give them over to you, that you may do to them according to every commandment which I have commanded you. Be strong and be of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you." Then Moses called Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, "Be strong and of good courage, for you must go with this people to the land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall cause them to inherit it. And the Lord, he is the one who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear nor be dismayed." Can you imagine being Joshua in front of all the people of Israel and having those words said to you? Moses doesn't say, you know what, you're going to fail. These people are terrible. He says, be of good courage. Be strong. This can be done because God goes before you. He encourages Joshua. He brings up Joshua. He builds up Joshua. And so not only does he not have reservations about preparing Joshua, but he doesn't even have reservations or qualms about preparing the Israelites as a whole as well. He wants to see them succeed and continue on. Look over in Deuteronomy 31 and chapter 1 of Deuteronomy and verse 37. I want you to notice a phrase here that we see 3 times throughout the book of Deuteronomy. And I've always thought this phrase was very interesting. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 37. You'll remember that the book of Deuteronomy, as you've studied here in recent memory, is the second giving of the law. It's the reiteration of the things that the people of Israel already knew. It's a reminder, here are the things that God has charged them. And as Moses is bringing up this reminder, even as we had read already, as he is old and as he's preparing to go to his reward, as God would provide for him, as we'll see a little bit later on, notice what he says here in chapter 1, verse 37. The Lord was also angry with me for your sakes, saying, even you shall not go in there. As he brings up the law again, I always thought that he was jaded, that he was bringing this up to kind of guilt trip Israel. And I don't think that's what's going on. I think what Moses is doing here is he's saying the consequences that I'm enduring, the justice that God enacted on me, this is happening to me so that you can learn to not be like me. Don't make the choices that I had done. God did this for your sakes so that you would see what is right and what is good and also what is wrong. Moses mentions this thing, that he did this for your sakes 3 times throughout Deuteronomy. But Moses isn't angry with them. He's fearful for them. And I think it's because at the close of all of this, as Moses continued on with his role, he didn't ask questions, he didn't quit, he didn't have reservations or qualms about the things that he was to do from here on out. But he was hoping that they would learn the same valuable lesson that he did. Go back over to Deuteronomy 34. Deuteronomy 34 and verses 1 through 5. Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 through 5. Moses learned a valuable lesson on all of this. All the things that he endured, all the things that he had seen God do, and the choices that he had made, both good and bad, that's Moses. He learned a tremendous, priceless lesson. If you look up at this picture, we saw this already. This is the summit of Mount Nebo. And how when we suffer consequences from those low points in our lives, and when we've got to kind of grin and bear it, this view, the good things that we see in life could maybe seem bleak and hopeless. Moses looks at that and he realizes he's not going to get to go over there. But because Moses used heavenly wisdom, godly wisdom, and he learned a lesson from all of this, this picture doesn't look as bleak and as black and white and stark as this one does. But it looks hopeful. And you can imagine him as he's up there on the mountain, and as the people go on without him, that he's content. He knows God answered him and answered his situation in justice and in mercy. And he knows he's not going to get to go to the promised land. But there, as he sits on the mountain alone, and eventually as he passes away, God was there with him. Look over in that passage that I had you turn to. It said in verse 4 of Deuteronomy 34, then the Lord said to him, as they're up on Mount Nebo, and they're looking at a picture like this, Joshua and the people of Israel are going on to success that God has led them to. Everything is as it should be. It said, then the Lord said to him, this is the land of which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him. God buried Moses in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his grave to this day. If we learn from our mistakes, if we bear the consequences, knowing that these things happen, these things come about because of the poor choices that we've made, we can be content no matter what the consequence or the circumstance is from there on out. Brethren, if you and I would learn the lesson that Moses did and not question when judgment's brought upon us, not question the elders when they're trying to look out for our souls and when something's been brought to their attention, not question our brethren because we're trying to sharpen one another and build up one another. Not question them. Don't quit your brethren. When you make choices, and we all do, that are terrible and that have consequences, do not quit your brethren. Do not quit Christ. As you learn those lessons as well, like Moses did, don't give up. Don't have any reservations about continuing to learn and to grow and to develop like Moses did. And when that day comes, like Moses, when it comes to go to God, you can be content knowing that you've lived in that relationship with him despite the mistakes that we made before. Look to two last passages as we close the lesson this morning. Hebrews chapter 12 and verses 5 through 11. Here, I think the Hebrew author puts this all together for us. Our final lessons, we sum all these things, no quitting, no questions, no qualms. We put all these points together, and the Hebrew author just brings this out in a nice, bowed-up package for us. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 5 says, "And you have forgotten," this should hopefully not be us, "you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens." Just like Moses, just like Elijah, just like the countless others in the Scriptures. It says, "And he scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening," that is, if we don't give up, if we don't question, if we don't have reservations, if we endure this, he says, "God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live?" A lesson that Moses learned. Verse 10, "For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." Notice what the Hebrew author closes that passage with. If we learn the lessons that Moses did, that we would have this peaceable fruit of righteousness. Does that sound familiar? Let's go back to James chapter 3 as we close. James chapter 3 and verse 18. Verse 17, we'll start there. "But the wisdom that is from above," the wisdom that Moses exhibited, and hopefully we should too, "is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." Moses learned a valuable lesson. You no longer see him complaining after his consequences are brought to bear, but you see him being the faithful servant that he always should have been. You see him being patient and pure and willing to yield to God. You see him not acting in partiality, but with impartiality, wanting God's people to succeed. You see him acting without hypocrisy. You see him acting in heavenly wisdom. Sometimes for us, it takes a painful reminder to show us how we need to live. And we think of it as painful, but we read in Hebrews chapter 12 what it's really like. And when those things come to pass in our lives, do we question, quit, or quibble? Or do we continue on in our relationship with God and stand tall in his desire for us? Those who use godly wisdom and peace will sow seeds and fruit of righteousness. Will you make that your choice this morning? I don't know your circumstance. I don't know the choices that you've made. But the Scripture says that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But we have an opportunity for salvation through his grace if you would come to him and learn the lessons that Moses did. If you have any need at all this morning, if you learned this lesson now and would like to come to Christ in obedience to the gospel, starting that relationship with him in baptism so that you could live with him and so that you might go to him when you die like Moses did, please let us know, especially as we sing this song of the invitation.